All right, Genesis chapter 3. I gave this message several years ago, but I think it bears repeating in that it is indicative of things that are taking place right now and that are emphasized by Jesus that will be taking place in the last days. As you know, the sequence of human history, God, he plants a garden called the Garden of Eden. And in that garden, he places Adam and Eve. Gives them basically everything that there is to have in this world. And you remember the story, how they blew it. And then there's the confrontation between them and God. And Satan is in that mix also. So all three of them get basically chewed out, as it were. But with the chewing out, there comes a promise of redemption. And this promise of redemption will not be fulfilled for thousands of years from the date that the promise was given. But in that promise, there is not just the promise, but Satan is also told that he's going to get his. And in that promise, Satan has a great big giant clue as to where this retribution and where this destruction is going to come from. And he acts accordingly. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. This is God speaking now. And in this instance, he is speaking to Lucifer, or Satan. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman. Enmity, it's mutual distrust, mutual hate, mutual dislike, and so forth. That's, I think, intuitively, that's one of the reasons I always have a problem when I see ladies or girls or whatever who have an affinity for snakes. It just, there's something in it that so rubs me the wrong way. Why, guys, I can kind of neutral on that one. I don't like snakes anyway. But when I see a girl that likes snakes, my mind immediately goes back to Genesis 3:15. And I'm saying to myself, what is wrong with this lady that she does not have that little capacity or that little thing in there that makes her distrust or not like snakes? Something's wrong. And that's just me. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. The first inklings of the virgin birth right there. The women don't have a seed. The guys have a seed. But God refers to it as her seed. So here's the first inkling of the virgin birth. Between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Satan's a lot sharper, for the most part, than we are. He picked up on this thing one salient point, and that is that his ultimate destruction is going to come through the female part of the race, the woman. He intuitively gets this. So the first thing he does, he sits down, I would imagine, and he thinks of a way that he can muck up God's plan. So by the time we get to Genesis 6, he pretty well has his plan set up and ready to go. And it's well underway. Genesis 6, beginning in verse 1. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So something pops out in this verse. What or who are the sons of God? Now, there are a lot of Christians who look at this passage and they don't believe that this has anything to do with angels, fallen angels, demons, or anything else. They believe that there was two basic sets of morality on this earth. One was Enos's seed, and the other was Cain's. So you had a godly line of men, and you had an ungodly line of men coming through. And they look at this verse, and they say that, well, when it says the sons of God, they're referring to the godly line of Enos and Seth, as opposed to the ungodly line of Cain. And so they completely discount the whole possibility of angels, fallen angels, being mixed up in this thing. Well, let's just put that on the back burner for a second. We've got a fact here that the sons of God, whoever, wink wink, they may be, were coming in under the daughters of men, and they were having kids with them. Now, why this would even be brought up, if it was just the natural, godly line of Seth and Enos, as opposed to the ungodly line of Cain, why even bother? It's just a natural course of events. I think it's highlighted because it is not a natural course of events the way it's going to play out. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. All right, we move down. In the Old Testament, the definition of sons of God is altogether different than a New Testament definition of the sons of God. There is a certain parameter, there is a certain requirement that if you are going to be called a son of God, that you have to go through. If it's in the Old Testament, this is going to seem like a weird one. Look over in Luke chapter 3. You think, I thought you just said Old Testament. We are. But the Old Testament reference is found in Luke here. Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. Verse 38. He's giving a recitation of the genealogy of the first guys born back in Genesis. So verse 38 says, which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. So you have God, he makes Adam. Adam is now referred to, by definition of creation, he is referred to as a son of God. Nobody else in that Old Testament was ever referred to by the description a son of God. Because Adam's kid is a son of Adam. Adam's kid's kid is a son of his dad, and so forth. The only one in that Old Testament who fits that definition of the technical son of God would be Adam, because God directly made Adam. Adam made his boy along with Eve. So technically, Luke is right. Seth and Enos and all these guys are not sons of God, they are sons of Adam. So Old Testament definition of the term son of God is, in this case, Adam, or, if you want to say it another way, a direct creation of God. You remember in Job, there was 3 instances. Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2, and in Job chapter 3, where the expression is, and there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And Satan and God have this conversation. Well, the only ones privy in that atmosphere, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. That's not taking place on this earth. There wasn't a time when Joshua and Caleb and Noah and Moses and all these guys all get together and present themselves before the Lord, and Satan is there amongst them. This is an event that's taking place in heaven. So there's no men involved as such. So again, that expression, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Who's that referring to? By definition, it has to be the angelic host. It has to be the angels, because they in turn are the direct creation of God. Angels were not made by the union of a man and woman. They are the direct creation of God. Hence, they qualify for the descriptive term as sons of God in that sense. Just like Adam was, and only Adam in that Old Testament. So if we get this distinction in our head, when we do run across from time to time that expression, sons of God, now it begins to make sense. Look over in John chapter 1. John chapter 1. Verse 12. John 1:12. But as many as received him, referring to Jesus, but as many as received him, to them, the ones that received him, in other words, the ones that were born again, the ones that are saved, but as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. Not those that believe about him, not those who believe that he lived or that he was, but those who believe on him. There is a monster distinction between believing about Jesus and believing in or on Jesus. New Testament definition of the term sons of God: all those who have accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. Why? Remember in John chapter 3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, he uses the expression several times, he says, ye must be born again. Hence, when you become a Christian, when you become saved, there is an act that is biblically defined as being born again. You are born of the Spirit of God. Hence, in that moment, you become a new creature. He says, old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. At that moment that you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, and the Holy Spirit comes down upon you and transforms you from dead to life, you are born again, because at that moment you have become a direct creation of God. The Spirit of God has transformed you. He has put new life into you. He has born you, as it were. So, New Testament definition of the term sons of God is anybody who has been saved or who has been declared as a direct creation of God. Same thing in the Old Testament, a direct creation of God. So the Old Testament, you've got Adam, you got the angels. In the New Testament, you got anybody who's ever been born again. Have you ever wondered, when you read the Old Testament, you never, ever, ever find the expression to anybody in there that they are born again? Nobody was born again until Jesus came. David wasn't. Joshua wasn't. Solomon wasn't. Moses wasn't. Nobody in that Old Testament was born again. Doesn't mean they're not saved. Doesn't mean they're not going to be in heaven. But the technical application, as far as being born again, it doesn't come along again from Adam all the way to Jesus Christ. So everybody in the middle, nobody is born again till Jesus comes along. Well, we know going back into Genesis chapter 6, where it says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men. They were fair and they chose them wives and they had kids. And these kids were special. These kids were different. These kids were head and shoulders above everybody else. They were mighty men, men of renown. These are the ones that I am convinced beyond all shadow of a doubt in my own mind, that when the mythology books, whether it be Greek and Roman or Egyptian, fill in the blank, when they talk about Zeus and Apollo and Hera and Jupiter and Mercury and Mars, all these old gods and goddesses that are mentioned in mythology, these are nothing less than those kids that were born from the union of the fallen angels and the women. Mighty men, men of renown, head and shoulders above everybody else. And so myth takes over. Centuries of talking about it takes over. And here, 6,000 years later, we have a whole framework of what these gods and goddesses looked like and what they did and how they acted. If you know anything about mythology, you can read in here beforehand that if these were the result of fallen angels and women, and you looked and see what they did in their lives, as far as mythology says, you can see that this is pure human. This is pure fallen angel type stuff. It's incredible how this stuff all ties together. Look over in 1 Samuel. Well, no. First, let's go back to Numbers. Numbers chapter 13. So after the flood, which theoretically, well, no, I shouldn't say theoretically. After the flood, all the fallen angels were dealt with. All their kids that they had produced with the women, they were all killed in the flood. All wiped out. The Bible makes no wiggle room. There was 8 people left. Noah and his wife, his 3 boys, and their 3 wives. That's it. But something takes place. Satan isn't done yet. Satan knows he was on the right track. He knew. He still remembers Genesis 3:15. He still remembers that through the woman, his ultimate demise, his ultimate destruction is going to come. He almost pulled it off. That's why it says in Genesis chapter 6, as far as Noah is concerned, it says that Noah was perfect in his generations. It doesn't mean that Noah was a perfect moral man as such. It doesn't mean that Noah was without sin. It doesn't mean that Noah was the greatest guy that ever walked the face of the earth. There was only one redeeming factor about Noah. He was perfect in his generations. In other words, that fallen seed, that fallen demon thing, hadn't touched his particular core of the family. He was still genetically pure. Whereas by now, a whole percentage of the world was genetically altered at this point. But Noah, he was perfect. The Bible is very precise in the wording and why it worded like it did. He was perfect in his generations. His particular little section of the family had not yet been genetically altered by the introduction of fallen angels into the human seed. When you take all these little disparate parts and you put them all together, it all makes sense. That's why it says, read the Bible. Not just read a portion here, read the Bible. And then all the dots begin to connect. Numbers chapter 13, beginning at verse 32. Numbers 13:32. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. These are the spies that Moses had sent into the land of Canaan, into Palestine, into Israel, to scout it out before Joshua was going to conquer it. So the 12 spies go in, they take a look around, they see it's inhabited by by giants, and they freak out. And they come back and give a bad report. Verse 33. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So the 12 spies go into the land, they see the giants, they freak out, they come back to Moses, they said, we can't take the land. 2 of them raise their hand and says, excuse me, Joshua and Caleb, excuse me, we can take it because we've got God on our side. The other 10 shoot him down. Moses says, okay, you guys don't want to do it, phooey. You get to walk around in this desert for another 38 years until every single one of you guys from the age of 20 and up are dead. So when they finally walked into the land of Israel, 38 years later, every single solitary person out of that 3 million that were there, everybody who was 20 years old and up on that day was dead, except Joshua and Caleb. They got to go in with the rest of the people. So now here we have a geographical location. It's centered, Israel. Giants. What happened? I thought they were wiped out in the flood. They were. Satan goes back to his old bag of tricks. Same thing. He's got more angels up there than he can shake a stick at. 1/3 of all the angels decided to go with him. It wasn't that he had 15 angels to pick from. He had literally millions. So whatever was wiped out in the flood, whatever was ultimately thrown into chains of darkness, which we'll get to in a minute, he still had cajillions of angels to pick from. And they just couldn't wait to jump at the chance to come down here. And so it happened again after the flood. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Beginning at verse 10. Deuteronomy 2:10. Now they're actually naming the tribes of which these angels had basically, the fallen angels and the union of the women and so forth, this morphing together. They basically now named the tribes because it is so prevalent in this part of the world that now they've got whole tribes basically named after them. It's not just a little isolated thing here or there. They got whole tribes. Verse 10, the Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims. Here comes that word Anakims again. Sons of Anak. Verse 11, which also were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites called them Emims. So once again, we've got this phenomenon taking place again, but this time, God isn't going to wipe out the world as such. Now, maybe it hadn't risen to the point that it was in Genesis chapter 6, where virtually 100% of the world was in danger of being, genetically altered because of this unholy union. Maybe this was just a little isolated thing, and God could deal with it in other ways. First Samuel, chapter 1. No, I'm sorry, 15. 1 Samuel 15. In 1 Samuel 15, beginning in verse 3. 1 Samuel 15:3. Now, go and smite Amalek. There's that name again. It just keeps cropping up in regards to these people. And utterly destroy all that they have. And spare them not, but slay, watch this, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling. This is the babies. What possible harm or what guilt could the little baby have? Even the sheep and the oxen and the camels and the asses, they just kill everything with these people. We're going back to flood mode here. We're going back to total annihilation mode here. Because the only way you can get rid of this systemic, genetically altered plague that has been infected and introduced into the bloodstream of mankind, you have to just cut it out. Period. You don't treat it with antibiotics. You don't treat it with aspirin. You don't treat it with a Band-Aid. You don't slit it and try to suck the pus out or any of this stuff. You have got to annihilate it. Period. And God says throw the babies in here too. Why? Because they're genetically altered. They're going to grow up to be the same thing that the moms and the dads are. Because they're already that. It's just they're still little babies. And so somebody will look at this Old Testament and they'll come across, and this isn't the only passage like this, but they'll come across these passages and they'll say, oh, I couldn't possibly serve a God like that. I couldn't possibly serve a God that hates people to that extent that he is willing to kill not just the moms and dads, but the little kids and the babies, the little sucklings, the ones at the mom's breasts. Are you out of your mind that you expect me to serve or love or obey a God like that? I want to serve a God of love. Well, that's what all got him into this trouble in the first place. Fallen angels are coming down and just loving the daylights out of the women and having these kids. So God, knowing the end from the beginning, he says, look, just don't take out the mom and dad. You take out the kids too. But the average cursory investigation of this, the average person will just look at it and say, well, I can't possibly serve a God like that. And so they just merrily walk their way right straight into the gates of hell. In Genesis 19, there is, let's take a peek at it. There's an interesting interlude here. Genesis chapter 19. We've already had the split between Abraham and his nephew Lot. Lot chose the cities of the plain, and Abraham took what was left, which was the wilderness area out there. Lot goes into the city, puts down roots. He becomes a big shot, an alderman or city councilman or something like that. And he's raising his family in this absolute cesspool of a community, Sodom. We have a certain lifestyle persuasion today that takes its very name from this particular city, which was obviously known for a particular alternate lifestyle. City of Sodom. So in Genesis chapter 19, beginning at verse 4, the two angels have come to Sodom. God himself has stayed back with Abraham, and Abraham is dickering with God about the city. This is the story when, God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, well, good grief. If there's 50 righteous people in there, can we possibly please save the city for 50? God said, yeah, I'll save 50. And you remember the story how Abraham whittled them down, 40, 30, 20. He got them all the way down to 10. God says, look, I'll tell you what. If we can find 10 righteous people, I'll save the city. Abraham says, great. He figures, well, there's got to be 10 righteous people. Obviously, there wasn't. So at any rate, that's where that little narrative ends. The two angels that were with God, they are on their way now to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy the city. So they come into the city. They hook up with Lot somehow. Lot invites them home to his house, and he's going to put them up for the night. Here we go. Verse 4, Genesis chapter 19. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round. In other words, they got all around the house, both old and young. Little queens and fairies here, they just, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and saith unto him, where are the men which came in to thee this night? But they weren't men. They were angels. The Bible makes that very, very clear. But the men of Sodom, having seen them hanging around with Lot, having them seen them go over to Lot's house, they naturally made the assumption they were men. So what do we conclude from that? We conclude that angels can look like men. Period. They're not 12 feet tall with wings and halos around their head. They look like men, to the point that the men of Sodom, who were experts in casing out men, were totally fooled. So, where are the men that came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. That's not to shake hands. That's a biblical acronym for something else. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him. Now he's gone out to confront these guys, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold now, you talk about hospitality. Behold now, I have 2 daughters, which have not known men. They're virgins. They're young girls. I have 2 daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Holy moly, what is going on here? This is incredible. Only unto these men do nothing. He's willing to sacrifice his 2 virgin daughters to these idiots out there. Well, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all, because I guess if he had sat down and really thought it through, they weren't going to touch these girls with a 10-foot pole anyway. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. So the guys are all clamoring, banging on the door, send these men out that we may know them. Lot goes out and says, trying to appease them, and says, no, I got 2 daughters. Do what you want with them, but don't touch these guys. Hindsight, probably not as bad as it looked, because probably he figured they wouldn't touch the girls. And they didn't. Okay. Keep that in mind. Angels look like men. Sons of God, in Genesis chapter 6, they came in unto the women. They can obviously procreate. They had kids. They did. They look like men. Jude, second to the last book, way back, just 1 page before Revelation. Jude, beginning at verse 6. Now we're kind of switching gears here for a second. And the angels, Okay, now we're on to angels again as such. The angels which kept not their first estate. Well, what can we read into that? The first estate. Well, the first place that you were raised, the first job that you had, the first place that was your responsibility. In other words, they left something that they shouldn't have left. They did something they shouldn't have done. The angels which kept not their first estate. First estate, maybe it was heaven. Sons of God saw the daughters of men, they were fair, boom, and they come down, and they have kids with them. So there's a certain group of angels, fallen angels, that did a particular type sin. The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation. Now we know that's heaven. That's their primary place of abode. They can come down to the earth to do certain specific jobs for God, or in the case of those who left God, for Satan, but their primary abode was heaven until the bad ones got thrown out. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he, God, hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. So this particular bunch of angels which left their first estate, which left their own habitation, he's got a special judgment for them. They're under lock and key someplace until some future date here. Keep that in mind. Turn back a few pages to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Beginning at verse 19. So in Jude we see a group of angels reserved in chains under darkness. Here in verse 19 of 1 Peter chapter 3 we read, by which also he, being Jesus, after his crucifixion and before the resurrection, in that 3-day period, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. That puts the date, and by definition, it puts the particular sin that these angels did. These, the ones in 1 Peter 3:19, or verse 20 here, these are the ones that God is referring to in Genesis chapter 6. Which sometimes were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, remember 120 years, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Second Peter chapter 2. In 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell to be delivered into chains of darkness. This goes back to Jude, when he's talking about those reserved into chains of darkness. But cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world and the ungodly. Why in the world? He keeps making these analogies. He keeps making these total opposite type connections here. We're talking about angels being reserved in darkness. Okay, well, what do they do to get there? Well, they sinned. Okay, when did they sin? Well, we see they sinned during the time of Noah. Wow. And what was the sin in the time of Noah? It was angels coming down and having kids with women. So it keeps snowballing and getting big and clearer and clearer and clearer. Verse 5. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Okay, there's a connection. Now we fast forward 1,000 years or so. And why in verse 6 does he make this connection? And turning it sounds like when you put the word "and" in there that these two events just take place 15 minutes after each other. Well, you got the flood here, and now you got Sodom and Gomorrah. No, we got like 1,000 years in between here. I'm just euphemistically saying that. Verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overflow, making them an ensample unto those who that after should live ungodly. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. So he's connecting 2 points here. He's connecting Genesis 6, the flood, and he's connecting Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. Why these two? Because they both have to do with strange flesh. That's a biblical acronym that does not mean good things. The union between a fallen angel and a woman, that's a strange flesh type combination. Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 men hooking up. Strange flesh. It is condemned of the yin-yang in Romans chapter 1. As clear as you can possibly make it. It is not right. I don't care what your affirmative lifestyle, alternate lifestyle, what the feeling or the mood that you're in that day, I don't care. From a biblical standpoint, it is as wrong can be. All right, let's wrap it up with one more. Luke chapter 17. Luke 17. Now keep in mind, when Luke wrote his gospel, and Peter wrote his epistle, I'm sure neither one of them ever read the other's letter. They were separated by years. They were separated by hundreds of miles. They were separated by different lifestyles, different missions, different jobs, different everything at that point. It's not like these guys all sat around a room and compared notes when they did this. None of the Gospels were written until 30 years at least after Jesus died. So it wasn't like the resurrection, on Sunday morning, and then on Monday morning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all got together in a room and said, oh, let's write a dissertation on the life of Jesus. And they all sat down and wrote it. No, nothing was written for 30 years later, around the time that Paul started writing his epistles. And so the idea that Peter and Luke are going to collaborate on this stuff is just totally out of the question here. Luke 17, beginning at verse 26. Jesus is speaking. And he says in verse 26, and as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. Whoa, just a second. You mean it's going to happen again? It happened in the time of the flood. It happened after the flood. Back when the Anakims and the Emams and the Mamimams and Samimams and all these guys were going, all these giants and so forth in the earth. Jude talks about it. Peter talks about it. And Jesus says in the last days it's going to happen again. In the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives. Ooh, married wives. Yep. And they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Verse 28. Likewise, once again, this connection, you can't get away. When they talk about one, they talk about the other every single time. Likewise, also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. So what Jesus is saying is the same phenomena that took place, that precipitated and caused the flood in Genesis chapter 6, which was basically, if you want to put it in technical modern day terms, it was genetic engineering on a cellular level with human beings. The introduction of a fallen angel with a woman, genetic engineering at its nth degree. Jesus says it's going to happen again in the days of the Son of Man. So just prior to the return of Jesus, it's happening now. Now, am I going to point out, oh yeah, I think that guy's a result of a fallen angel? No, I'm not that sharp. I'm not spiritually that perceptive, and I think Satan is masked. I think he's learned from his first mistake. He's not making these guys 8, 10, 12 feet tall anymore. He's not making them like the gods and goddesses of myth, like we've come to understand in all these years. I think he's learned. He's going to keep it subtle. He's going to have it downplayed. He's going to keep these new kids, as it were, looking just like you and me, so that we can't point our finger at them and say, this is this or this is that. So just something to think about. How the Bible is so unbelievably connected. How that these dots just are screaming to be connected. But this is a phenomenon that took place at the very, very beginning of the human race. Intermittently, it's reared its ugly head. And Jesus said in the last days, it's going to take place again. So it amazes me, and it thrills my heart to see the unity of this book, the complexity of this book, how all these things fall into place, and I stand in amazement when I look at it. Something for us to think about, something for us to contemplate, that we are in for an exciting time, to say the least, in these next few years. Father, I thank you that as bad as some of these things may seem, as bad as it is, not just seems, but as bad as it is, the whole culture, Father, is deteriorating around our feet. It's incredible how fast and exponential this stuff is going. But we do have the promise that at the end of the day, you're still God. None of this slipped up on you, none of this slipped by you, none of this took you by surprise. You're not boxed into a corner. You're not scrambling for a solution. You're not saying, oh, gee whiz, I didn't see this, now what do I do? How do I alter this? How do I make up for it over here? You got it all under control. Sometimes we despair when we look around. We get discouraged when we look around. We get just to the point, maybe we get apathetic and we just give up. Help us to remember at the end of the day, you are still on that throne. All things are upheld by the word of your power. Satan can rail, he can rant, he can rave, he can do whatever he wants. And at the end of the day, he's cast into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is going to contain hell. Father, help us to not be discouraged by what we see around us. Help us to be strengthened by the fact that you know what you're doing. Help us to be strengthened by the fact that you've got it all pegged. Help us not to be weary in well-doing. Help us not to despair. Help us not to give up. Give us that strength and encouragement to just keep on one more day at a time until you come back. Help us to do our part in our circle of friends or influences where we can maybe do something that can be used by you for good. Father, bless your people. Strengthen them, encourage them, lift them up, swift kick in the butt, whatever it takes. Bless your people. In Jesus' name.